All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code podcast5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends.
In the US, we think, oh, like the more stuff you have, the more money you have, the better off you're going to be, the more happy you'll be. Bhutan totally proves this wrong. Now, to give you a sense of just how underdeveloped it is, there isn't a stoplight in the entire country. The entire country. But there's no outside American businesses, no McDonald's, KFC, Starbucks. But what they have been able to do is find happiness.
Michael Easter is a leading voice on how humans can integrate modern science and evolutionary wisdom for improved health, meaning, and performance in life and at work. He travels the globe to embed himself with brilliant thinkers and people living at the extremes. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Comfort Crisis, and he's a professor of journalism at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. It's a pleasure to welcome Michael to the show. Michael, welcome to the show. I have been looking forward to this. I think I stalked you on DMs and was like, please come on my podcast. I loved your book, The Comfort Crisis. It was just eye-opening and inspiring and motivating, and just, I think, what every young American should read. So thank you for taking the time to write it.
Well, thank you so much for the nice words, and thanks for trusting me to come on your podcast and talk about it.
Definitely. Well, can we start from the beginning like you did in your book? I'd love to know what led you to writing The Comfort Crisis and going on this, I'd call it a quest for like finding yourself and improving yourself, and then sharing all these teachings with everyone in your book.
Yeah. So it was this handful of things in my life. So first of all, is that I worked at a health magazine for a lot of years. I worked at Men's Health Magazine. I was an editor. And I noticed in that job that every single thing I wrote about, whether it was fitness or nutrition or mental health, whatever, to improve your life in that domain, you had to go through discomfort. So if you want to get fit and thereby improve your health, you're going to have to work out. Working out is not comfortable, right? If you want to eat differently in a way that's going to be more healthy, there's going to be some hurdles there too. You might be hungry. You're also going to have to fight back impulses to eat Doritos if you're me, right? And even sort of taking hold of your mental health, you have to unpeel some onions and ask some questions that aren't always the most fun to do. So I kind of had that realization, or just kind of noted that, like, oh, that's interesting. So then in my own life, I come from this long line of men who were good at drinking. Let's just say that. And when we drink, we tend to raise hell. Now, most of my uncles are well familiar with the Idaho prison system, and I was sort of walking that same path. Now, on paper, I was in a relatively good spot in life. You're like, oh yeah, he works in a magazine I've heard of. Well, he has a house, whatever. But internally, I was a little bit of a mess, and I just couldn't get a hold of my drinking. I was the type of person where if I have one, then like 10 more sounds even better, right? And when you drink like that, it tends to cause problems in your life. And so at a certain point, I just, I tried to quit drinking a bunch because I realized this probably wasn't a good path to be on. But eventually I just kind of hit this moment where I realized if I keep drinking, this is going to be the comfortable, easy thing to do. But at the same time, it's probably going to kill me early. I don't know if I'm going to die in the next 5 years. Could be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years down the road. I just knew it was going to be earlier than it would be if I were to stop. So I could go on this other path. And this one was, uncomfortable. I didn't know where it would lead. And that was to get sober. And I decided to sort of venture into that unknown. And it was uncomfortable. It's definitely the hardest thing I've ever done. But on the other side of that, my life improved like across the board, full stop, every single way. I mean, stuff you could measure, like I was less fat. I was fitter in the gym. My finances were better. Like all these things you can put a number on, better. But more importantly was sort of the internal shift, I think, is that I just had more appreciation for life. I was a nicer person. My work got better. Like all these things got better. So that, again, solidified this idea that to improve your life, you have to go through discomfort. Then I get sent by Men's Health magazine to go on this trip with a guy whose name is Donnie Vincent. I'm writing a profile of this guy. And so Donnie is this backcountry bow hunter and filmmaker who goes into these crazy remote areas for months and months at a time. And he does movies about them. And the movies are kind of like Planet Earth, except they have hunting in them. And so we spend just like 5 days off the grid in Nevada. It wasn't that long, but I mean, we're really hiking in there. We're super high up in the mountains. And what was interesting about it is just how uncomfortable it was in every way in terms of having to carry everything. I mean, to get water, we'd have to hike down to the stream and hike it back up. And hunting is very boring, surprisingly. I think people think it's like action-packed. It's not at all. And on and on and on. I mean, it's freezing cold the entire time. And so having made those two sort of observations about discomfort and its benefits, I get home and what I really realize is, oh man, like my life at home is just so much comfortable than it was out there. But at the same time, that's how humans lived for like all of time. We're exposed to the elements. We had to work for everything. We had these long periods of boredom. Just everything was tough. And so I wondered how this shift from evolving in these super uncomfortable environments to now being thrust into a world where we have climate control and sofas and millions of calories in the pantry in the form of the aforementioned Doritos and all other kinds of stuff. And also just not having to physically put in effort really to live anymore, and on and on and on. I wondered how that changed us. And so that was the genesis of the book. That's a long way of saying that's the genesis of the book.
Well, it's so interesting because throughout the book, you uncover all of these things that make us feel uncomfortable, whether it's talking about death or feeling hungry or physical activity that actually, hurts and is uncomfortable, not like a light walk or jog that we're used to and trained for. Like, what does it feel like to really put yourself to be uncomfortable and to put yourself into discomfort, and what's on the other side of that? Like, I look at you as an example and I think, I wonder, like looking at you now, you put yourself in such an uncomfortable place to go into sobriety and to full stop, like pull the ripcord and to look at this massive, expansive growth that's happened for you personally from getting out into nature, being bored, being freezing, like eating dehydrated weird food that sticks to a spoon, like your relationships, like writing this book, being on all these amazing podcasts, like just how much gratitude do you have for that one decision? And what do you feel like has come from that personally?
Oh, everything. I mean, Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, you can't even literally everything good in my life I can tie to that. And it was super hard to go through. Obviously, like it was, I had to. I mean, first off, your body immediately just goes into like, no, we need alcohol, dude. And so like you just feel like hell. I also have this terrible habit of just like chain smoking when I would drink too. So my lungs are just like, they're like kicking up some sort of cancer. Just all these terrible things. But then, even harder is that you have to start to relearn how to live because you've developed all these patterns that are counterproductive, and alcohol essentially becomes the comfort blanket, right? So anytime anything comes up that is uncomfortable, you just lean into that. It's a very quick, easy fix. It's instantaneous. It just solves your problems. Nothing solves a problem like the first drink.
Right.
And so now I have to go, oh, well, I'm going to have to figure out a different way to deal with this. And this is not going to be as comfortable and easy as alcohol. So I have to figure out all these different ways to do everything. But in doing that, everything improved. I can't even just add everything. So as part of the book too, which you kind of alluded to, is that 5-day trip that I talked about, that I did the magazine article for, that's how I met Donnie. And then Donnie, eventually he calls me because now I'm really toying with this idea of like, oh, I want to do a book that really looks at discomfort and how comfort and discomfort have changed over time and how that's affecting us today. And then Donnie calls me up one day and he's like, hey, do you want to go to the Arctic with me for more than a month? It's going to be this extreme, dangerous hunt. And I'm sitting in my air-conditioned Las Vegas home. And like the first thought of my mind was like, hell no. But he gets in on this sales pitch, right? And he's good. He's like, oh, it's going to be the most epic adventure a human could ever be. We're going to fly in. We're going to see. It's just on and on and on. And for whatever reason, I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Then I hang up and I'm immediately like, what have I gotten myself into? And so I have to again, completely sort of overhaul my life and train for that. I have to learn and do all these different things to prep for it. And then, we go out and we spent more than a month out there and we're on this caribou hunt. And in the book, that I tell the story of that, I don't know what you kind of quest. You use the word quest. That's a good word. I tell the story of that quest. And as I'm facing certain discomforts that our ancestors would have faced all the time, that shaped us as humans, that still today can keep us healthy. As I'm facing those, I sort of break out and talk about each one specifically. So for example, when, after a couple of weeks, because we're only packing in maybe 2,000 calories of food, but we're carrying these 80-pound packs everywhere. It's just so much work. We're probably burning 4,000 to 6,000 a day. So I start to lose weight really fast. And I am so hungry, unbelievably hungry, constantly hungry. And so I use that as a way into this idea of how hunger has changed over time, how we are far less hungry than we have been in the past, which is a good problem to have. But now you look at a lot of the research and something like 80% of eating is driven by reasons other than hunger. Because we eat because it's a certain time, because we're stressed, because we're bored, because on and on and on, not necessarily because our body needs food. And we also tend to default to really calorie dense foods. That's what we prefer, because in the past, that would have kept our ancestors alive when there wasn't enough food. It's like you want to eat a bunch of food and try and gain fat because you inevitably are going to have time where you're not going to be able to find food and you can pull on that fat to survive. So we still do that, except we don't have that time period where we would have needed to pull on it and lose it. So it just kind of accumulates and accumulates. And now you see, 70-something% of people are overweight or obese. And that's a tough problem to solve. But I think, it's one that we definitely need to think about.
And in the book, you talk about real hunger versus reward hunger, and this reward hunger being cued by acute or chronic stress for a lot of us. Your personal experience of Friday, sending those emails and then being like, I did it, I made it, let's eat something. And I think, being a nutritionist for 10 years, so much of what drives people to eat has little to do with hunger. It really has to do with habits. It has to do with the family dynamic. It has to do with all of those stressors that you're talking about. So I'd love for you to dive a little bit deeper into what you learned. You worked with a nutritionist named Kashi. And so I'd love to learn about, for you personally, like, what did you uncover in this process? And what were some of the nuggets of research that you think most Americans could start incorporating to really have freedom when it comes to getting to their ideal weight?
Yeah. And I would love to hear too, since you've worked with so many people, I'd love to hear what you see as some of the triggers for eating, because I always find that fascinating. But so I think what was most interesting from working with Trevor, and now before I talk about him, he's this kid is a trip. Let's just say that. He's very, very smart. So he graduates college when he's 18. He gets his PhD by 22. One of those just, off the charts, brilliant, but so brilliant. He's a little bit quirky type people. And, but he doesn't look, when you think of a person who has this insane IQ and gets his PhD so young, you're probably thinking this sort of like dweeby, like glasses, very awkward person. It's like, this kid is 6'2" and he's like 250 pounds of solid muscle with this like shaved head and beard. He looks like an enforcer for the Hells Angels. So it's just like, he's just a character. So I spent a bunch of time with him. And I think what was most interesting about him is that he's not so much interested in what a person eats. He's not saying that that's not important, but he's more interested in why a person eats. Because if you look at why people tend to eat, it's what I just talked about. There's all these different, social, internal, cultural, whatever triggers that drive us to eat. And we're also surrounded in food that's calorie dense. It's like unknown to our brain, right? We're not necessarily adapted to be surrounded in Reese's Puffs and Doritos and all that kind of stuff. And another thing that he really works on with people is becoming aware of just how much food you're eating. Because when you look at research, and I experienced this myself, I'll actually lead with that. So for example, I started working with Trevor just to kind of see how it all works. And, I thought I was eating pretty healthy, but at the same time, I wasn't technically overweight, but I was like, my BMI was on the high side. I could have lost, maybe could have lost a couple pounds. But I'm going like, I'm doing everything right. And he has me measure my food for a week, and then we're going to change it. And just that week of eating normally and measuring, for example, I would normally eat for lunch an apple, a protein shake, and peanut butter on the apple. So I'm like, all right, this is a wise choice, Michael. This is, 400 or 500 calories. It's blah, blah, blah. The first time I measured the peanut butter,
you probably eat it like my husband.
Half
a jar later.
Yeah. And it's just soul crushing. I'm like, oh my God, this is like the peanut butter alone is like 600-700 calories.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you look at research around what people think they eat, we are always wrong. Yeah. People generally have no idea how much they eat. And we all like literally 99.999% of the time, we are going to err on thinking we ate less than we actually did. And there's a good evolutionary reason for that, right? More food always made sense in the past. So we're kind of wired for more food. And when they do studies on this, they find that people who are overweight, they tend to be quote unquote wronger with the amount of food that they eat than people who are quote unquote normal weight. So people will misunderestimate their calorie intake by like 1,000 some odd calories a day. But you can understand why, if you were like, well, I'm not losing weight on this diet, but you think you're eating, say, 2,000 calories, but you're actually eating 3. Well, of course, the number's not going to budge. So a lot of what he's trying to do is build awareness of how much a person is eating, and then what is triggering them to eat in the first place. And for a lot of people, think of the word comfort food. Mm-hmm. Food becomes comfort. And we've really sort of engineered hunger out of our lives. And I think sometimes we need to learn that it's okay to be hungry sometimes. It's like we fear it, like it's this like creeping specter of death, but it's like, you're going to be fine if you're hungry for a few hours. Like, I promise the world won't end, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So for me too, it was, once I started really working with them and becoming aware of what I was eating, then it was, okay, well, why am I eating? Which you alluded to before. It was like, on Fridays, I'd come home from work and I'd kind of be like, oh, week's over, time to offload. And I would just start eating like crap out of the, out of the pantry, you know? I'm interested to hear though, have you seen this with your clients, and like, what are their triggers and kind of how do you think about that chapter? Because you have so much expertise in that topic.
Well, you did hit the nail on the head. It's used as reward. So a lot of times, like at the end of a day, parents have put their kids down and they're like, ooh, let's have our dinner, or let's have our dessert, or let's have our wine. Then we have like the distraction. So you have to send a hard email. You have to do real work. You're waiting to go to your workout class, but you're like, I'm hungry. You know, there are things that's like anxiety triggers of like, ooh, I'm living in the future, or this thing that's going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to have a comfort blanket before I have that uncomfortable thing happen. And then there's also this baked in theory from like years ago that we should be eating 5 to 6 small meals a day. And so much of my work has been dismantling a lot of that, of like, we don't need to be snacking. And so like even your quote in the book that like we're snacking 75% more than in 1968. And we're eating 15 hours a day. Like I see this so often in my practice. And in my first book in 2016, I was like, we shouldn't be eating more than 12 hours ever. And we don't need to be snacking. We're not toddlers. And I loved how Trevor said, like, eat like an adult. Like if you're eating whole foods that stretch your stomach, that regulate hunger hormones, that can sustain you, you're not going to have massive drop-offs in blood sugar. You're not going to have like this feeling like, oh, I need to snack, or I need that 5 or 6 small meals a day. And being hungry is okay. Right.
Yeah.
And so many things that you said like really resonated with me in his work. And I did love that you talked about not having rigid rules, because I don't like rigid rules, because all I've seen them do is backfire. When I tell a client they can't have popcorn or they can't have Doritos, in your case, it's like the Doritos are screaming, and that is ultimately going to end up in that Friday afternoon binge. And it's kind of like, hey, look, like if you eat like an adult, or I always say like whole foods, mixed macronutrients, and you fill yourself up in that one sitting, you should be able to go 4 to 6 hours without thinking about food or eating food. But I'm never saying like, here's your list of things you can't eat, because in my early career, like 10 years ago, when I did kind of subscribe to like a more rigid rule, all it did was make me want to eat more of that stuff. It made my clients want to eat more of that stuff. And so it's always funny, because there is a time with other nutritionists where, you know, there's really, or doctors, and you mentioned some of them, like, you know, and worked with some of them. It's just like looking at the research, I'm like, oh, I have to be doing it this way. And I try to follow rigid rules. And it's just like, if I'm not making the rules up for myself, like I'm going to break them.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I mean, being like 80% good is going to get you really, really far. And I think too, what I think is interesting is, I don't have kids, but 2 things I thought of as you were talking is, I think parents too probably have a propensity to like, oh, your kid ate 4 of the 6 chicken nuggets. I'll eat those. All right. So if you stretch that across the 3 meals that you feed your kid, all of a sudden it's like, and you forget that you ate that. And so this stuff sort of, we just unconsciously just eat food when it's around. And the 5 to 6 meal thing, 5 to 6 meals a day thing, when you apply that to what we were just talking about with people not knowing exactly how much they eat. Okay, well now apply, you know, too much 5 or 6 times across the day. And you can see how we've sort of ended up being in a little bit of a tight spot with our weight.
Right. So let's talk about ways that you discovered to lower intake, to really take into account what you are eating, and some of the research around like pulling back.
Yeah. So for me, knowing how much I was eating was like the moment where things changed. And I had to do that by weighing food, which some people hear that, oh, you weigh your food, you're a psychopath. It's like, well, we measure all kinds of things for health. We measure blood pressure. We measure BMI. We also measure our money in our bank accounts. There's a million different things. Yeah. Yes. So I'm not suggesting that people weigh their food for the rest of their life. But what I am suggesting is that I think it can be exceedingly informative, at least for a time period, because then you go, like I did, oh, a serving of peanut butter is like a half a ping pong ball and not a softball, right? And that just sets everything in motion to change the game. So for me, what I'll do now is that I also have noticed that, to your point, whole foods, foods that have one ingredient, foods that are ingredients and not contain ingredients, those tend to keep me fuller longer for fewer calories. So if I'm like, look, I know that, I exercise quite a bit, relatively active. I know that if I eat about, say, 3,000, I'm making this number up, but 3,000-ish calories a day, I'm good. Well, if I were to eat that in McDonald's, I would probably still maintain my weight if I hit that 3,000 calorie number. Would it be smart? I don't know. But I would maintain my weight. At the same time, I would be starving because 3,000 calories in McDonald's is like 2 meals. It's like not a ton of food. Now, if I eat it in foods that are ingredients, those foods are just they have more volume. So that tends to fill me up so much more. Like one of my go-tos is potatoes. When you look at the research on potatoes, they are like the OG superfood. I mean, studies have shown they're the most filling food per calorie. They have so many like different vitamins and minerals. I mean, you can almost live off potatoes. It's actually quite amazing. So I eat a lot of potatoes. I eat oatmeal for breakfast. That's like one thing. But at the same time, I don't have rigid rules. Like when we go out to dinner at a restaurant on, say, Saturday or Friday night, I'm going to order what I want to order. And I'll also account for that earlier in the day. Like if we're going to, say, an Italian place and I'm like, yeah, I definitely want chicken parm that's like fried and covered in cheese and it's just a calorie bomb. I'm like, okay, well, maybe I just skip breakfast and then I can kind of account for that, So I think it's just not having those hard and fast rules. I think that you see that people who are successful over the long term, they don't have these, authoritarian food rules, but they also tend to eat whole foods most of the time. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people out there that maintain their weight on McDonald's. Those people do exist, but they are rare.
Definitely. Well, and the interesting thing was that in Trevor's experience, and he did this with you and other clients, it wasn't telling people not to have McDonald's. It was like, hey, this is kind of like what I need you to do and keep track of everything and how you're feeling. And they all came back saying like they were starving. So, so it's like learning that yourself is very different than having people tell you, hey, if you eat processed foods, you're going to be starving and you're not going to have that stomach stretching, hunger hormone regulating experience. But you can do that with whole foods. It's like, go figure it out and you'll see for yourself what it feels like to go without food after a whole food meal.
Yeah. And it's also, I mean, it's a long game. You learn this stuff over years.
Right.
Whereas currently in diet culture, it's positioned as like, hey, here's this 8-week, you're going to lose whatever amount of pound diet, and you're never going to develop the habits in like a super, super short stint. And it's going to backfire.
Right.
So I think also realizing like you're going to learn this stuff over time. You're going to have some hurdles. You're going to have moments where you gain a little back and then you go, oh, okay, well, what did I do that gained it back? Oh, here's this new thing. And you just keep integrating information. So I don't think that, trying, like I'm not a person who says that trying quote unquote fad diets is bad, because I think a lot of people pick stuff up from them. You could be like, oh, I noticed that I really liked this meal I learned on it, or this type of food tends to keep me full. But then it's just sort of integrating all this different information to figure out what works for you.
Definitely. Well, let's take a turn and start talking about nature bathing, the benefits, like getting your body in nature, working out really hard in nature. And I'd also love for you to talk about what a Miyagi is.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So let's start with nature. Now, I first started thinking about the effects of nature when we were in the Arctic, because we had this moment, we're sitting on this hill basically, and we see this herd of caribou. And we had a camera guy with us. His name's William. And so we sent him to go get footage of them, and he spooks them. They start sprinting right at us. I mean, they don't realize that we're just laying down in the tundra, Donnie and I. And they get probably within 30 yards of us, which is like, I mean, the ground is rumbling. You can smell them. You can just see everything. And finally, they realize that we're there and they sort of peel off. But it was like this amazing, I mean, kind of a life-changing moment for me. And we had sort of spikes in stress like that while we were out there, where we'd have like these crazy animal encounters or we'd have crazy weather. But overall, I was like the least stressed I'd ever been in my life. And that's somewhat surprising considering that it's one of the most dangerous places on earth, right? So when I get home, I want to know why did I feel so stress-free out there? And I meet this lady whose name is Rachel Hopman, and she basically studies the human brain on nature. And her work shows that nature is like full stop, good for our bodies and minds. But I think what's most interesting is its effects on stress. So there's this concept that she talks about called the nature pyramid. And it basically tells us how much time we should spend in different types of nature for different benefits. And you can kind of think about it like the food pyramid, where there's like, eat this much grains, this much meat, whatever. So at the bottom of this pyramid is 20 minutes, 3 times a week. And that can be in the type of nature that you find in a city park on a really tree-lined street, just like very accessible. And that is associated with decreases in stress and increases in productivity. Now, the next rung up the pyramid is 5 hours. So 5 hours a month in the type of nature that's more out there. It might be like a state park, like there's trails, but you're not totally off the grid. You're probably still going to have self-service. The 5 hours in that type of nature is associated with big boosts in happiness and decreases in depression. And then at the very top, and this is, I think, where it gets really interesting, is if you spend 3 days once a year in like backcountry nature. Trails, you may not get cell service. There's not like bathrooms and roads. That amount of time is associated with these like really interesting changes in the brain. So in everyday life, our brains ride these waves that are called beta waves. And these are sort of frenetic go, go, go waves. They're associated with stress, with burnout, with basically the modern condition, how we're all crazy now. But after 3 days in the backcountry, people's brains start to ride what are called alpha waves. These are the same waves that are found in experienced meditators. So they're associated with feelings of calm, collectedness, at peace. You just feel great. You're like, oh man, I love the world and everyone in it. Like life is perfect. And we only get those after 3 days in the backcountry without our cell phones. So with all of this research, he's found if you're using your cell phone while you're out in the wild, it cancels out a lot of these benefits. Now, of course, like you can occasionally check it or take a photo or that, but if you're on your phone the whole time, it's going to cancel everything out. And so I think this makes a pretty strong case that we need to spend more time outside, because when you look at the research, something like 93% of our time now is spent indoors in climate control, not outside. And there's a ton of reasons why the outdoors seems to be really good for us. And it's hitting all these different things. So you can't really pin it on one reason, but the answer is pretty clear that we should spend more time outside.
Yeah, I would say like that was really profound. Like this part of your book for me, in just finishing the chapter and being like, we need to go to Zion, babe. Like, I need to go. Cause I do. I mean, I think about camping in Big Sur with my kids, and I have no self-service, being an entrepreneur that has clients texting, calling, emailing, books, the like emails, podcasts, products. You're like, make it all stop. Like, I'm so grateful for it. But also I don't have an off like time. Like, I feel like I'd rather, Chris, my husband, talks about a time because he was a lawyer for 8 years and then now he's a recovering lawyer. Nice. But he talks about one summer when he was younger and he pulled pallets. Like his job, like this was pre like cell phones, smartphones. He didn't just get to like listen to a podcast. He was in the summer heat in Southern California at this pallet yard with a hammer. And how satisfying it was for him at the end of each day to have broken down all of these pallets. And that's like one of his favorite jobs growing up. And to think about just the boredom, the being out in the sun, being, it's not exactly nature, like in a pallet yard, but to have the job end when the day was done and to feel that satisfaction of like, no one's checking in on me. I'm not getting constantly barraged with emails and how many inboxes we have now when you add social media and DMs and like, it's like too many forms of communication that prevent deep work and like a calm, peaceful life. So, yeah. I mean, just in seeing that, I was like, okay, I'm off my Peloton. Like even before this call, I'm like, all right, I'm doing the stairs at Strands Beach, which is like a beach close to our house, has a set of stairs and we can see the ocean. And just having that and reprioritize and refocusing on that, like I immediately felt the benefits.
Yeah.
Even since just reading your book, which is why I was so excited to get you on the podcast, because I think and we'll get to the checklist phenomenon because I think that's really important to talk about too. But we just have these checklists where we're going, oh, I need to work out. I need to clear my inbox. I need to do X, Y, or Z. And it's like, none of it is fulfilling on this deep level that allows us to feel peace.
Yeah. Two things is one is I also think that there's become an expectation to respond to all of that stuff within a certain time period. Right? It's like, you got to respond within a couple hours. And so I think we need to think about normalizing responding to an email like 3 days later. Like, it's fine. The world's not going to end. Now, obviously some stuff is urgent, but I think our definition of urgent has changed in a way that renders it completely moot. Like just stuff that we think is urgent really isn't as urgent as we often think. The second thing is I think your husband's experience is really interesting because I think there's something to obviously not only being outside, but also to doing work with our hands. So now a lot of people, most people, we work with our heads. We obviously in the past had to think, process information as we would complete tasks, but those tasks were always had an element of manual labor. So if you think about how humans evolved, we basically had 3 jobs, more or less, really fundamentally, when you break it down. And that was to get food, make kids, and don't die. Right? Those were the jobs. Now they all have like you think about how humans would have to get food. Certain groups would hunt, which is a very physical act back then. You would also gather, also very physical. We'd also, be trying to survive by building shelter, doing all these different things with our hands. And it was all outside. So we're kind of evolved to do that sort of stuff. And now it's all shifted to this, sort of psychological work where it's, think work, which I think, I'm not saying that's not rewarding, but I do think that there's also something really important about trying to work with your hands occasionally too. And I've seen this among a lot of my friends that only work with their minds, is that they're starting to pick up hobbies like woodworking and just random stuff like that. And they're like, man, this is my time to like zone out. You're focused on this one specific task that includes your mind, of course, but also includes a physical element. And I think there's something very sort of Zen-like to that can help us today. So I'm not saying quit your job and become a woodworker by any means, but I am saying that I think trying to find ways to integrate your mind and body in a task, I think can be rewarding for people. And there's probably a good evolutionary reason for that.
Definitely. I mean, we know that chopping wood outside increases testosterone. It's the number one activity to increase in testosterone in men. So I was like, maybe there was a little something there in your vitamin D levels and like just shutting it down and like almost a meditative action of like the same thing over and over and over again. And how like calming that repetition might have been. Like there's so many things layered there, but I'm like, that actually sounds weirdly like really nice. Okay. So let's talk about what a Miyagi is, because I feel like this is also something I personally want to achieve because of what goes into it. I think it's compelling because you're not sharing it, but tell me about what it is and why it's like an interesting thing for humans to do.
Okay. So first off, I'll say that everyone gets the word wrong. Oh. It's a misogi, but that's okay.
Misogi. Sorry.
Literally, I would say probably 95% of people mispronounce it, and that's okay. So the idea is, if you look at how humans evolved, we had to do hard things all the time. like take on these big epic challenges in nature. Now, this could be from some big hunt. It could be from moving to our summering to wintering grounds. It could be just because the world is dangerous and there's tigers lurking in the bushes and on and on and on. Now, each time we were thrust into one of these challenges, now we didn't choose that, right? We got thrust into these situations. We would learn what our potential was because we would have to basically figure out our stuff or die or get injured, right? So we had all these moments where we would go, I don't know if I can do this. And then we would do it and be like, oh, I'm capable of far more than I realized. So we would grow as humans. And this happened all the time. Now, today, things are different. It's suddenly possible to live and even thrive, or maybe, without ever being challenged. You can have a decent job. You can have enough money. You'll have enough food. You'll have enough water. You'll have on and on and on. You'll have all these things that we used to have to be challenged to get. But because of this, we no longer have these moments where we are thrust out of our comfort zone, have to figure out our shit, for lack of a better term, and learn something about ourselves and sort of find what our potential is, really dig deep and like, oh man, I'm more capable than I ever thought. Okay, so with that in mind, I meet this guy whose name is Marcus Elliott, and he is this Harvard-trained doctor who decides he doesn't want to be a doctor. He declares he's going to revolutionize sports science, which is a little bit kind of arrogant, but he actually ends up doing it. He is the first guy to really integrate big data and movement data into professional sports. And so with his system, you can basically see that he'll analyze all these different athletes. He's got contracts with the NBA, NFL, et cetera, et cetera. He can look at the data and be like, hey, the way your knee caves in on your jump, you have a 40% chance of tearing your ACL in the next year, because he's looking at it compared to all these other players who have come through his system. So it's really interesting, fascinating stuff it's all based on like numbers and data and figures and stuff like that. But he also realizes that, what really improves human potential, it can't always be measured. There's just these certain things and skills and qualities that certain people have that they just believe in themselves. They're like, no, I got this. Like, this is not a question of whether or not I got this. And so then the question is like, okay, well, what builds that, right? How do you expand a person's potential like that? So he does this thing called Misogi, and it's basically a recreation of those ancient challenges that we used to go through in order to find new potential. And so once a year, we'll go out in nature and do something really, really hard. So the rules are basically rule one, it's got to be really hard. Make it really hard. And he defines that by saying you should have a 50-50 shot at finishing whatever the task you invent is. A true 50-50 shot, because today, even when we take on challenges that have a physical element, we usually know we're going to accomplish them, right? If you do a marathon, you're not going, I don't know if I can finish. You're going, I don't know if I can finish in my goal time of whatever it is, 3 hours and 40 minutes or something. So the second rule is don't die. Now, this is like a fun tongue-in-cheek way of saying, like, don't be an idiot about this. Make sure you're safe. Because the idea is that you want to do something that's totally sort of quirky and out there, just like invent something weird. And now the point of that is because we often do so many things as an almost competition with other people. If I pick a marathon and I learned that my neighbor ran it in 3:40, well, guess how fast I'm running it in? 3:39. 100%. And so by kind of comparison shopping, we don't actually realize that ultimately limits us. Because what if I could have run it in 3:20? I'm still running it in 3:39. Like, right? We pick these artificial metrics and we hit them. And so by just inventing something sort of strange, you get rid of all preconceived notions of what you're capable of. And what tends to happen is that when someone picks a Misogi, and to give you some examples, Marcus with a group of people have done ones where, this is a very weird one. They got a 85-pound boulder and they walked it 5 miles underneath the Santa Barbara Channel. So one person would dive down, walk 10 yards carrying this boulder underwater, go up for air, and the next person would go down, so on and so forth, until after like an entire day, this boulder was at point B. But there's also simpler stuff. Like you can choose, okay, I see this mountaintop from my house every single day. I'm going to see if I can get there in a day. Now it's just make something up. And what tends to happen is if you've appropriately gauged the difficulty level, the 50-50, you're going to hit a moment where you go, okay, I have to stop. Like, I'm done. I got to quit. This is way too hard for me. But if you can keep going, you just kind of put one foot in front of the other, keep on keeping on, you'll have another moment. And that's where you look back and go, well, hold on there. I thought my edge was back there. I thought I was only capable of back there, but I'm past that now. So I undersold my potential there. And maybe, just maybe, that means you're also underselling your potential in all kinds of other areas of your life. And that's the important realization that comes from something like this. And when I first kind of heard about this from Marcus, I was like, okay, yeah, like, it's cool, but it's kind of quirky, kind of weird, whatever. Then I started to really sort of dive into science and what's going on here. And in the past, we used to call these rites of passage. So these rites of passage popped up in all different cultures around the world. When we had a person who was at point A in their life and we needed to get them to point B, where they were more capable, more confident, better able to contribute, we would often send them out into nature to do something really, really hard. They would struggle, they would doubt themselves, but they would overcome that. And in turn, they would get all these qualities that we wanted them to have so they could contribute. They'd come back into the tribe as literally a new person and would have kind of moved on to an important point in their life. And I think that we do not have traditional rites of passage like this anymore. And we also know that people really thrive on challenges. When you look at all the research, the two groups that have the worst mental health are the people who have way too many challenges and traumas in their life. Like it's just one after the other, after the other, after the other. That's not good for your mental health. At the same time, people who have zero challenges in their life, they have equally poor rates of mental health because they have no idea what they're capable of. So anytime anything comes up, it's like this new, like, oh my God, what do I do? You want enough challenges in your life that you learn what you're capable of, that you learn what you have on board, that you can realize like, hey, when things come up in my life, like I can handle this.
It's so interesting because you can look back on your childhood. I do feel lucky that I wasn't in the percentage of people with too many traumas. And I also am equally grateful for my parents, in reading this part of your book, for not handing me everything. I had a psychologist on the podcast, Jen Curtis, and she talks about snowplow parents who snowplow every discomfort out of their kids' lives. And they get to this place where she works with them going to college. And a lot of them have anxiety, depression, and they're looking to their parents at what should my major be? What college should I go to? Because they haven't made any personal decisions. And they also haven't gone through any challenges. They don't know that they can do hard things. It's exactly what you're saying. They don't know their potential. They haven't pushed through. They haven't built up this confidence, this resilience, this tolerance to stress and uncomfortable situations that make you capable as an adult.
Yeah.
And so it's just these themes keep coming up in different aspects of my life, whether it be parenting or in your book, The Comfort Crisis, to go okay, I need to make things uncomfortable for my kids or allow that to sit and allow them to experience that so they can have resilience and have happiness in their life and know their potential. And it's such an important lesson, I think, for so many of us. And I have seen it on the other end of the spectrum where, I work with some really amazing people who've had killer careers and then they have kids and we see this unhappiness level in their children where they have had so much given to them and they've never had a misogi and they've never had that rite of passage and they don't know who they are. And so it's such an important part, I think, and interesting that you're not comparing yourself to anyone else, which I think is also this really sad theme that I'm seeing in the younger generations with so much screen time and so much social media, which you also talk about in the book.
The last point I'd add about the misogi and resilience among kids is that when hard things come your way, that's the ultimate teacher. That's how humans learn. I mean, I think about my own background. We usually develop skills when we have challenges. So I was raised by a single mom. My dad wasn't around. My mom also traveled a third of the year for work. So I have this rotating cast of nannies. like new nanny every single year. That was not fun. But guess what? Because I grew up learning to adapt to all different personalities, having to talk to them, being thrust into new situations. What do I do for work now? I thrust myself into weird situations and I talk to people I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
So, like that happening to me as a kid, it determined the course of my career. And it gives me an advantage over people who are in the same path of work, whose lives as children were more stable. Full stop. So I think that the lesson for this to people listening is that if you are going through a problem now, you're facing something hard, you're probably going to pick up a skill from it that you don't know what it is now, but it'll show itself down the road and you'll be like, aha, maybe it was worth it, even though it sucked in the moment.
I also would love for you to touch on IQ versus tolerance testing, because I think this is a good transition. Just in what really, when we look at outcomes for kids as adults, like what's a predictor of success and happiness?
So when you look at what determines where a young person ends up in life, their career, we tend to think it's IQ. We always have. But there's work from this guy named Ellis Paul Torrance. And he basically followed these kids throughout their entire lives. And what he did is he gave them both IQ testings and he also gave them creativity tests. And then he saw what they did. Like anytime and one of these kids from a group would do something interesting or big, he would write it down. It's like, oh, was valedictorian of college, now works at the State Department, became a whatever. You get the point. And what he basically found is that creativity testing was a much better predictor of their outcomes in life, good outcomes, than was IQ. And what I think is interesting about this today is that I think what's really important in life now is creativity, because we kind of live in an idea-based economy. And if you can come up with new, different ideas that are more creative, I think that that gives you an edge. And I think that this is also strange too, because so creativity, when you look at the research, seems to be tanking among students. One researcher I spoke to said we're facing a creativity crisis among kids. And one of the main reasons for that is because kids are all consuming the exact same media. So like you're not going to have great ideas if you're doing the exact same thing as every other kid. So I think there's a case for spending less time on media. I'm not saying that like never go on Instagram, never watch YouTube. I'm not saying never, but I am saying that less is probably good, because now you look at the average person today and they spend more than 12 hours a day engaged with digital media. So in the book, I have the stat of 11 hours, 6 minutes. Since the book has been published, we have added another hour onto our days.
Wow. I mean, just like making me want to like never let my kids be on television ever. And I have pretty strong boundaries there, but like you see, as they get older, like those boundaries are pushed and they slip. And it's all of these kind of stats that make you go like, wait, I need to get my kids in nature. I need to be off our phones. They need to be bored. They need to be tested physically and mentally, because then at the other end of that, like their potential is so much higher. Their creativity is so much more broad. And ultimately, like, I think for me as a parent, I want to be happy. I want my kids to be happy. And it just is eye-opening that we have it so backwards. Like happiness is not a destination. It's not things. It's not this checklist of like checking everything off. So I think I'd love to wrap this interview up with how you sort of wrapped up your book, which is like, let's talk a little bit about like what cultures are happy and what are they thinking about that we're not thinking about, and what really is going to make us happy in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for this section, I traveled to Bhutan. Bhutan is a super small country. It's about the size of South Carolina, and it's right next to Nepal. And if you look at it in terms of developmental rankings, you know, when like the World Bank goes in there and does all their math and says, here's how developed you are. I mean, they score abysmally. They're like well past 100. But what's interesting is that when they do happiness rankings, is Bhutan consistently ranks in the top 20 happiest countries on earth. This is despite the fact that they are not developed, because we in the US, we think, oh, like the more stuff you have, the more money you have, the better off you're going to be, the more happy you'll be. Bhutan totally proves this wrong. Now, to give you a sense of just how underdeveloped it is, there isn't a stoplight in the entire country. The entire country. But there's no outside American businesses, no McDonald's, KFC, Starbucks. But what they have been able to do is find happiness, and that is through, I think, a variety of ways. So I'm just going to name out a few. I don't know if there's a ranking to them and what does the most. But one aspect is that they're very aware of the fact that life is impermanent. So citizens in Bhutan are told to think of their death at least once a day. There are these little clay pyramids all over the country that are they're mixed with clay and ashes of the dead. And they're a reminder to everyone that, like, hey, you're going to eventually die. So the implication is, are you using your time well? Right? Whereas in the US, we don't really want to think about death at all. And you see this in our funeral system and our food system and on and on and on. In Bhutan, there's also a recognition that maybe material goods and sort of having this checklist of life of the things you have to do to make yourself happy, maybe it doesn't apply. Maybe you can just do things right now to be happy. So I traveled there, and one of the people I met with was this monk who lives in this shack up on this cliffside, and it was this insane journey to get up there. just picture the most cliche adventure scene of meeting this monk on a mountain you ever could. It was that, but probably even more so. So I walk in and I sit down with this guy, and he described that in America, and he has an interesting perspective too, I'll add, because he lived in the US for a couple of years because he was dating a woman who was the translator for the Dalai Lama. So we lived in Atlanta for like 3 years and then eventually came back to Bhutan. So that in America, we live life like it's a checklist. We go, okay, there's this series of accomplishments you need to check off. And we think that each time we check off one of the accomplishments, that's when we're going to be happy. So it's like, got to graduate college, got to graduate high school, got to graduate college, then I'll get a car, then I'll get a house, then I'll get married, then I'll buy a new house, then I'll have kids, then I'll blah, 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 on and on, right? And with each one of these, we think, oh, that's when I'm going to be like, that's when I'll have arrived. That will be it. But then once we accomplish that thing, we just move on to the next thing, and that consumes our mind. So we're not really living in the present. Whereas in Bhutan, they're very much like, look, I know I'm going to die at one point. I know that these material possessions are probably not going to move my life forward as much. They don't live by the checklist. They try and live more in the moment. They're very aware of their impermanence. They're doing a lot of other things that can improve their happiness, like a lot more time in nature, a lot less screen time, a lot more community, like on and on and on. And that seems to really boost their happiness, despite the fact that, yeah, they don't have all the crazy nice things that we do. No one out there is wearing a Rolex or the newest shoes from Nike and all that kind of stuff.
Wow. I think that presence, just in your research and thinking about the Bhutanese people and what they don't have and how they found such like meaningful lives and community and like what is really truly important is such a reminder. And then also like makes you want to be Bhutanese. Like, how do I bring that into my life? Like, how do I keep that presence and fill my life with gratitude every single day for what I do have so that I can, it's almost like checking things off that you don't need. Like, you want this specific car. Like, what would it feel like just to check it off before you got it? Like, I don't need it. Because that's like so freeing. You talked about actually how debt was related to this for the Bhutanese people. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, they don't have debt. And so I talked to a bunch of people when I was there, and one of them is this guy who, just like we have a Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense, they have a Secretary of Happiness. So his job is to basically just research. All he does is research happiness. He's got this big team. They research happiness. They poll people. They figure out what makes people happy. And one of the main reasons that he thinks that the Bhutanese are so happy is no one is in debt. The cost of living is very low. People don't accrue debt. They also don't accrue medical debt because they have universal health care there. And, he pointed out, like, look, our healthcare, it's not perfect. But at the same time, if you have an operation that can't be done in Bhutan, the country will pay for you to fly to a neighboring country that has better medical care. It could be India or somewhere else. And they'll pay for you to get all that done and all your flights and everything. So we just don't accrue debt. And that seems to really give people a sense of freedom. I mean, you think about, what sort of decisions would you make if you weren't locked into a monthly payment of whatever it is on your mortgage or your car? You might decide to do a totally different job, right? I think a lot of people would. I don't think everyone would, but I think a lot of people would go, oh, wow, the possibilities are now endless. Right now, they're not endless if you've got a ton of debt.
Definitely. Well, this was fascinating. Your book was fascinating. I'd love to leave the audience with what you think is the most important takeaway that you've learned in researching and writing The Comfort Crisis. What do you hope that people take away from your book?
So we evolved to avoid discomfort at all costs because that is a survival mechanism that kept us alive. Well, today it's backfiring. So what I've found is that we default into comfort. That fixes our problem in the short term, but it comes with these big long-term expenses. When we always eat comfort food, when we avoid exercise, when we do all these different things that are going to make us comfortable in the short term and to avoid discomfort, we're really selling ourselves short and setting ourselves up for failure in the long run. So the TLDR is do hard things. If something is uncomfortable, it might just be good for you, and it's probably not going to be as bad as you think. You're going to be better in the long run.
Get out there and learn your potential by doing hard things. Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time. I'm so excited for people to snag The Comfort Crisis. It was just an awesome read, and I could talk to you for like another hour. I have like so many other notes, but this was really fun. And I think we touched on all the really important things that I thought people should hear about, but definitely go grab Michael's book. Where can they follow you online? Where can they snag the book? Where can they learn more?
I'm at eastermichael.com. A good way to follow with what I'm doing and find new stuff that isn't in the book is I have a newsletter you can sign up for there that goes out every week. And I'm also on Instagram at Michael_Easter. Yeah,
perfect.
That's it. Yeah.
We'll link to your newsletter, your website, and your Instagram in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bewellbykelly.com and follow me on Instagram at bewellbykelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.